What it do, family? Before we get started with today's programming, if you're not subscribed, please make sure you are subscribed. Please make sure to hit the likes button. Please make sure that you share this program because the information that I'm going to be putting out today is going to be combating a lot of the poll numbers. It's going to be combating a lot of the research studies. It's going to be combating people's feelings when it comes to the Black community and what they feel we should and shouldn't be getting due to so-called quote-unquote studies that's been implemented. We're going to start off with this article here from NPR from September 14, 2016. Sugar shocked. The rest of the food industry pays for lots of research too. Oh yeah, this is where we starting off. Sugar shock. That described the reaction of many Americans this week following revelations that 50 years ago, the sugar industry paid Harvard scientists for research that downplayed sugar's role in heart disease and put the spotlight squarely on dietary fat. What might surprise consumers is just how many present-day nutrition studies are still funded by the food industry. Nutrition scholar Marion Nestle of New York University spent a year informally tracking industry-funded studies on food. Roughly 90% of nearly 170 studies favored the sponsor's interests, Nestle told us via email. Other systematic reviews support her conclusion. So 90% of all the studies that she looked into, think about that for a second. 90% of all the studies that she looked into, over 170 studies, and 90% out of 170 studies favored the interest of the person who funded the study. And this is just in nutrition. So think about it. Think about how long, back to your childhood, how long they told us that if we ate the things in the 5 food groups and things like that, then we would be healthy and all this other stuff. Only to come to find out years later that that was a total farce in itself. The whole table, the whole food chart was literally a farce. This is what we're looking at here. So if 90% out of 170 studies favored the funder, then if we look outside of food, would that be the same case? If we look outside of the food industry and the nutrition industry, would that still be the same case? Let's move on. This is coming from the National Library of Medicine. And what I wanted to read to you here, I want to get to the plain language summary. And I'll link everything that I'm showing you guys. I'm going to link all of it to you guys in the description, so you're going to be able to go through and read all these articles for yourself, come to your own conclusion. However, I have certain things that I want to get through and very little time to get through it. So, plain language summary, and this article here, like I said, comes from the National Library of Medicine. Okay? And the study is called The Influence of Industry Sponsorship on the Research Agenda, a scoping review. So, like I said, I want to go down here to plain language. Industry-sponsored studies tend to be biased in favor of the sponsored products. Several studies have explored this issue, documenting how the funding source can influence the design, conduct, and publication of research. Although more difficult to define, sponsorship can also influence the research agenda, namely the initial step in conducting research, during which the research questions are chosen and framed. In our scoping review, we aim to synthesize studies that have explored the influence of industry sponsorships on research agendas across different fields of research. We identified 36 studies. Corporate adopted similar techniques across different industry sectors and fields of research. Industry tends to prioritize lines of inquiries that focus on products or activities, that can be commercialized, ergo drugs or devices. The included studies also suggest that industry reshaped fields of research through the prioritization of topics that support its policies and legal positions. Let me read that again. The included studies also suggest that industry reshaped fields of research through the prioritization, of topics that supported its policy and legal positions, while distracting from research that could be unfavorable. So, in this study, we're able to see how corporations have adopted these techniques of putting their hands into the cookie jar and giving you the cookies, and then having the outcome fit their narrative, having the outcome fit their marketing, having that outcome fit whatever box they want that outcome to fit. And this is what's happening in these studies. So, with the majority of all studies really being in the same boat, can you really trust any of these studies? Science and engineer indicators. The state of the U.S. science and engineering. This is from 2020, and this is from ncses.nsf.gov. I want to read this highlighted portion right here. Many organizations performing R&D received outside funding. They may also be significant funders of R&D themselves. Mirroring its predominant role in R&D performance, the business sector is also the leading source of R&D funding, 70% in the United States. So we know out of all studies, that 70% of all studies are funded by corporations, organizations, to fit a certain narrative that they want to fit. So it's no mistake that they have all these polls and all these studies when it comes down to the needs of Black Americans. All these polls and all these studies whenever Black Americans say we need X, Y, and Z. But all of these polls and all of these studies are funded by the same corporate backers, the same government backers who wants to deflect from us getting what's owed to us in the first place. That's what's going on here. Let me continue. These are other examples. how drug company money is undermining science. Now, we're not going to read these examples that I'm about to give you guys, but I will be linking these in the comments. In the description as well. So that's one. Well, that's another one. Excuse me. Hidden conflict. Pharma payments to FDA advisors after drug approval sparks ethical concern. And this definitely isn't new. We already knew that Big Pharma has been putting money into the pockets of FDA agents and things like that for a long time. Nothing new. Same thing with the food industry. They pay the FDA in order to get certain things passed. Nothing new. It's nothing new. But it's in the whole scheme of it all. I wanted to make sure that you see these examples as well. Same thing with the tobacco and oil industry. Tobacco and oil industry use same researchers to sway public. All of that. Why you think that, it's so expensive to go electric? Why do you think that, there are so many people that are against fossil fuels and how it affects or negatively affect the globe? However, they ain't doing a dang thing to stop any of it. And not even so much stop it. They're benefiting off of it itself. Because if it didn't exist, they wouldn't have nothing to speak about. People like AOC and these Bernie Sanders types. It's absolutely the truth. But when they're sitting or put in the position to actually do something about it, no, you get deflect and benign and neglect. But benign and neglect usually is only for the black community, but they still use it in other areas too. Don't get it confused. They absolutely do. And when it comes to this tobacco and oil industry situation going on, the little war between green and fossil fuels, it's all a ruse. It's all a ruse, because once those people who were fighting against it before they got in office get into office, all that changes. All that changes. And also, it was the Supreme Court that gave corporations the ability to actually be an entity in this country. And when I say entity, I'm not meaning like corporate. I mean as a person. It was the Supreme Court that allowed these companies to put money in the pockets of these politicians for their own interest, in order to push their interest and not the interest of the people who actually put those politicians into office. So we see this pay to play situation in almost every industry when we're talking about the United States of America. And the research industry is no different. Apparently, the research industry is big bucks. This article here, it comes from the Washington Post. White supremacy was at the core of 19th century science. Why that matters today. Last month, Tamara Lanier, I might have slaughtered that name, but she'll forgive me, a retired professional from Connecticut, filed a lawsuit against Harvard University, it's always Harvard, over photographs of her enslaved ancestors taken for the racial scientist and Harvard professor Louis Agassiz. I might have slaughtered that name too, but screw it. During the 1850s, Lanier accused Harvard of capitalizing on these images of her ancestors, two enslaved people named Renti and Delia, for centuries. In her suit, Lanier asserts that her family should control the rights to the photos, not the university whose racist faculty member commissioned them. And I totally agree. Lanier's lawsuit draws attention to how universities continue to profit from their past dealings with the slave system. But dig into the history, and this case has even deeper meaning. For Agassiz was more than just a Harvard professor. He was a leading figure in a wildly popular movement that brought together pro and anti-slavery forces to use science to justify white supremacy. To use science to justify white supremacy. To use science to justify white supremacy. Something like they use numbers to justify white supremacy. Something like how they use studies to justify white supremacy. Something like how they use polls to justify white supremacy. I just felt like I needed to reiterate that because we are not seeing anything new under the sun. My grandfather used to tell me back when, I was a churchgoer myself, before I walked away from that whole situation there. My grandfather used to tell me that the devil is so unoriginal. And the devil is just a copycat of everything God is. He just want to be God so bad he copies everything that God do. He copies his power, but he don't have the power that God has. And the funny thing to me is these devils keep using the same playbook. Nothing changes. Nothing changes. The look might change, but in all actuality, nothing actually changes. They stick to their same playbook because they know that it works. They don't have to change too much of anything. When they see something stop working, then they tweak it a little bit. But they put all their forces within every area of every industry in order to protect white supremacy. That's what it is. That's what it is, and that's how it's going to be until we cut them out, until we take it out, until we actually step the hell up and let them know that we're here for what we're owed and we ain't going nowhere. What was that song that Puff used to? We ain't going nowhere. We ain't going nowhere till y'all can pay us, because y'all owe us for life, because that's what it is. Let's get back to this article. I apologize. I kind of strayed away a little bit, but I brought all this stuff up. I showed you that information, and also, hold on, I want to show you this information as well. Let me bring this up here. So this comes from a Congressional Research Service here. It's the U.S. Research and Development Funding and Performance Fact Sheet. So when we look at this, and this is from 2022, was September 13th, less than a year ago. Well, actually, it just got over a year. A little over a year ago. Okay. So let's go down here to the highlighted portion that I have here. Research and development in the United States is funded and performed by a number of sectors, including the federal government, state government, businesses, academia, and nonprofit organizations for a variety of purposes. This fact sheet begins by providing a profile of the U.S. R&D enterprise, including historical trends and current funding by sector and by whether the R&D is basic research, applied research, or development. The final section of this fact sheet includes data on R&D performance by sector. The United States became a global leader in R&D in the 20th century, funding as much as 69% of the annual global R&D in the period following World War II. Think about that. 69% of the annual global R&D in the period following World War II. How much money was spent to push someone else's narrative? Okay, figure 1 shows the growth in total U.S. R&D expenditures, from 1956 to 2020 in current dollars. U.S. R&D in 2020 was 83 times higher than it was in 1956 in current dollars, and more than 11 times higher in constant dollars. That's a lot. 83 times higher. That's almost 100% over. That's almost 100% over. By sectors, business funding R&D grew. Business funding R&D grew the most during this period. However, faster growth in total R&D spending of other nations reduced the U.S. share of global R&D to approximately 30.7% in 2020. So let me see. I think I got another. Hold on. Yeah, there we go. I got a chart here. So this is a chart right here. This is a chart of what people have been spending and who's been spending it. So, as you can see, from 1956, it started off real low with the business funding research. And by 1984, that research kicked the hell up. That's the same thing for federal funding as well. By 1984, federal funding had kicking all the way up. 2022, just 3 years ago, business funding is the highest of all of these here, where higher education, their funding is very minimal. Non-government is very minimal. Non-profits is very minimal. So all that research, all that funding benefits who? Benefited who? All of that funding that went to that research was nothing but a payout. And those scientists who sold their soul, those researchers who sold their soul, those doctors who sold their soul, those politicians who sold their soul for these corporations and other business entities are very evident. Because when you speak about these things, they try to stray you or deflect to something totally different. But when you talk about their funding, if they fund you, they run you. When you speak about how certain politicians are actually pushed on us by certain groups who fund them, certain politicians are pushed on us by certain interests of other people who don't have our interests at heart, then you see we telling the truth. You can see with your own eyes the money behind the madness. And there was this saying, if you want to get down to anything, follow the money, right? Well, that's what this the research is. The research that comes out is a part of that money too. So we need to be looking at everything that they throw at us and say, well, the research said, okay, well, who funded that research? Who does that research actually benefit? Does it benefit the funder? We need to start asking these questions, because if not, we'll have our own people running around using these numbers to justify a point that they're making about something that shouldn't even be required. We're fighting for reparations. It shouldn't be required to have any research studies when it comes down to because we have so many of them that says what we went through and what we've been through. It should be required to look at poll numbers to see how many people are in favor of you getting something that's owed to you. It shouldn't be required to even have to think about anybody else but our group in this situation, because it isn't required of anyone else to do the same for us. Whenever the government or anybody wants to do for anybody outside of the black community, they just do it. They don't care about the polls. They don't care about anything. The Ukraine versus Russia situation, they took a poll on that. And 37% of Americans was in favor of sending money to Ukraine. But the majority of Americans was against it. Do you think that stopped them? Do you think that stopped them from sending money to the Ukraine? They took a poll on whether or not we should be helping house, feed, and educate these illegal immigrants. 40% of Americans said yes. 56% of Americans said no, and the other didn't even want to answer. Do you think that stopped them from doing it? You want to talk about numbers? 51%, more than 51% of the homeless population are black Americans. So why haven't they did any of the things that they're doing for the illegal immigrants? For them, for us. Because the numbers don't matter. The numbers don't matter until it matters for them and their narrative. So why are we taking their numbers and lifting them high as if they mean anything, when over 70% of all research is biased? It's spewed. It's a lie. And it favors the funder in the situation. So this situation with reparations and people going around saying, well, 68% of all Americans are against reparations. And that same 68% didn't have a say in anything else. When the Jewish Americans got reparations from the government because they got it from the government. I already did a video on that as well. No matter what Marianne Wilson says. No one said nothing. When the Native Americans got their reparations, no one said nothing. Hell, when the Native Americans just got some more land given to them by way of Jimbo Django Clyburn, no one had nothing to say. And if they did say something, it didn't matter. The illegals that are here getting 3 square meals a day, getting a little spending money and getting housing, people spoke up against that. But it didn't matter. So it's time for us to stop worrying about the dang on polls. The polls don't matter. Damn the polls, you're going to pay what you owe. And while we're on the topic of reparations, let's look at that poll that says 68% of Americans are against reparations. Because I looked at the study itself, the question that was asked to the people who participated in the study, and I found some very interesting things, namely something very interesting in particular that contradicts that whole narrative. Give me a second to pull it up here. So this is the questionnaire, the Pew Research Center questionnaire that was given. And I'm thinking that this is the number of Black Americans who actually participated, 3,912. And then you have the general public total of 6,513. Now, the problem with this I already see is that I would like more disaggregated data on the Black Americans. Are they descendants of American slaves? Or are they descendants of people who moved here or immigrated here who are Black, which now makes them Black American? We don't have that information here either. However, I want to go down to and this is a very good document to look over as well. So when you guys get a chance, please look over this document, read some of these questions, because you get to see some of the mindset of some people. However, I want to get down to the nitty gritty. I'm going to get to the question at hand, because I would like you guys to see what I see, what I saw, and question it. Give me a hot shake there. Okay, here we go. So this question asks, reparations. Do you think descendants of people enslaved in the U.S. should be repaid in some way, such as given land or money? 77% of Black Americans says yes. 17% of Black Americans said no. And that's my question on whether or not they're descendants of American slaves who said no, or if they're Black immigrants who are now Black Americans because their parents immigrated here and they were born here. So now they're Black immigrants, Black Americans, immigrants. I would like to know that. But in the general public, it says 30% says yes, 68% says no, 2% has no answer. Now, this is the thing that slapped me in the face like a ton of bricks. The very next question that no one seems to bring up when they bring up this study. No one seems to bring up this question whatsoever, but they're consistently saying, well, 68% of all America don't agree with paying reparations to you guys. Okay, well, let's move on to the next question. Ask if wants reparations. How much responsibility, if any, do the following have for repaying descendants of people enslaved in the U.S.? And if you go right on down here, 81% Black Americans says the United States government is responsible for what? Repaying descendants of people enslaved in the U.S. But then when you look over here, general public says 75% says the government, the U.S. federal government, is responsible for what? Repaying descendants of people enslaved in the United States. So this question and the question before it have conflicting answers. So you're telling me that 68% of the general public is against Black Americans getting reparations in the form of land and cash payments. However, you're telling me that 75% of the general public says that the United States federal government is responsible for repaying descendants of people enslaved in the United States. So how does that happen? How does that work? How does that work? It can only work if the people who participated believed that they would have to pay the money out of their pockets themselves. If they believe that the responsibility in themselves shouldn't be on them, it should be on the government. And if they have to pay out of pocket, then they're not in favor of it. Now, if it's the government that has to pay out of pocket, well, yeah, the government, well, they are responsible. They were responsible. The same thing that we've been saying the whole time. The government sanctioned slavery. The government sanctioned Jim Crow. The government sanctioned redlining. The government sanctioned these banking situations. The government sanctioned all of that. And we've been saying this for a while, that the government must pay reparations due to them sanctioning the actions of slavery, Jim Crow, and everything else that Black Americans been through. And in this study, the general public seems to agree with this. And I'm going to prove that point too, that if it was on them, they're saying basically no to that. That's what this is here. That's what that 68% that says no, right? Because when you look at banks and businesses, 65% of the general public says that they're responsible because they profited from slavery, right? College and universities, 53% of the general public says that, hey, you guys benefited from slavery, so you guys must pay something. But when you get to the descendants of families engaged in the slave trade, you got 44%. 44%. And then you got 17% who refused to answer. 17% who refused to answer. 29% says little to none. So that's what it is. I don't care about anybody's personal feelings, because in that same study that they're talking about, the rest of America, 68% of America is against reparations, yada, 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 yada. In that very same study, in the very next question, that same group of people said that the government is responsible for paying back the descendants of American slavery. More people said that the government is responsible for paying the descendants of American slavery than it was who said they wasn't in favor of cash or land payments of reparations to Black Americans. And just to hammer this home, I'm going to read these two questions one more time, and I'm going to give you my final thought. Do you think descendants of people enslaved in the United States should be repaid in some way, such as given land or money? 68% said no in the general public. How much responsibility, if any, do the following have for repaying descendants of people enslaved in the United States. The United States federal government. 75% of the general population says, ding, 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 they're responsible. So this is how the numbers are played with. This is how the information is literally given to you, bits and pieces to benefit their narrative, but they won't give you the full piece of bread that actually benefits yours. They'll give you the crumbs. They will give you crumbs that fit their narrative as long as it fit their narrative. But as soon as they see that big old loaf of bread that says what you've been saying, oh, they're going to tuck that away. They're going to tuck that away. And since most people don't look up the research study, the questions that took place in those studies, a lot of us don't even know what's really in those studies, whether they really benefit us or not. Because to tell you the truth, that actually benefited us. That actually benefits us. So now anybody who comes to you who says, hey, 68% of America don't feel like Black Americans should get reparations, you can now say, nah. 75% of those same people in that same study also says that the government is responsible for repaying the descendants of American slaves. It's actually the very next question after asking whether or not people believed whether or not we should receive our reparations. So you can't say one without the other. You can't say one without the other. See, people might not want to pay out of their pockets, but they already recognize that the government is responsible for paying us back in the first damn place because they sanctioned it. It was their actions that led to the actions and led to the place in which we live today. These are the facts. These are the facts. So, like I said, all of these studies, all of these polls, we need to start taking a fine-tooth comb to them and going over the funding of these studies, and then actually looking into these studies and looking at the questions that was asked, looking at the method that was taken in order to answer these questions. Then we'll have a clearer picture to see. And in that clearer picture, we'll be able to not only see, but we'll be able to actually say, no, that study was actually produced by this group of people in order to produce this desired outcome, which they actually got. Because as it says, 70% of all research and studies is biased. And with that being said, family, like, share, subscribe if you ain't subscribed yet, and comment on this. Let me know. Did you know that over 70% of all research is biased? Did you know that, 75% of the general public actually says that, the United States government, the federal government, is responsible for paying back the descendants of enslaved people in the U.S.? Because they damn sure don't say that. They damn sure don't put that narrative out when they're putting out the whole 68% of Americans are not in favor of reparations. But they ain't saying 75% of Americans are in favor of the government repaying the children of the enslaved in the United States of America. Because it doesn't fit their narrative to say that. Even though the study shows different. That being said, peace and love, family. Until the next broadcast, I'm out.